I'd like to welcome you to the final lecture in the Road to the White House in spring of 2016, and also point out to you that there will be a fall version of the MOOC that will be offered starting in September. You can find that by going to openeducation.blackboard.com and clicking on Pace University. So, what do we know at this point? Again, it's late April, early May of 2016. What do we know? Well, I would argue that the takeaways from this particular nominating cycle, even though it's not done, there are several, and one of them is that Trump and Sanders clearly changed the nature of campaigns. And I think this is important to remember. Trump ran a very unorthodox, a very different campaign, and it appears he's going to be successful with it. Bernie Sanders also ran a very different campaign in the sense that he depended on small individual donations, millions of them in fact, and he likes to point out that the average was approximately $27 per donation to keep his campaign going. It wasn't a matter that he lost because he didn't have the funding, as other candidates have lost when they've lost their funding. This has permitted Sanders to continue in the process. It's a unique and important way the internet-based campaign funding appeals that he made resulted in what I think will be very much studied, and some will try to replicate it in the future. So the question, though, is Trump and Sanders, even though they ran uniquely, is this going to be the pattern for the future? I mean, the Trump pattern was to use social media, especially Twitter, to get his message out. In fact, he talked in some of his campaign rallies and in his victory speeches about the new press being Twitter and the fact that he controls the content of that by what he tweets. So I think that's important. So what's the change? Let's think about what people may be talking about changing. I think a lot of people would argue this is really a very long process. Okay, I think they would also argue that there's too much money spent, probably well over $1 billion spent in the process just to get to the nomination. Third, there's so many different rules. The rules differ from state to state. And third, there's so much confusion over this. And fourth, some of the rules really keep people from voting who want to vote because of the open versus closed primaries. And then the final point is some people would say there's too much control of this by political parties and by their leadership, especially with the Democrats in terms of superdelegates and with the Republicans in terms of their attempt to, nascent attempt, which never got off the ground, I would argue, to deny Trump the nomination at the convention. So what will change? Well, this is very interesting, and the thing that I need to point out to you that's most important is that this process is largely a process run by both political parties. It's not something run by the government per se. And I think since that's the case, it's going to be very difficult to bring about significant change unless the political parties agree to it. And I would argue that parties are very reluctant, as any organization is, very reluctant to give up control of any processes that they might have. So I think it's unlikely that you'll see a significant change. But what are some possible suggestions? And I've got four here that I would just mention. One, some people would argue we need to shorten the process, that we don't need a 6-month process, which really becomes an 18-month process because of the early maneuvering and so forth. Second, some would argue we need to go to regional primaries. I mean, why should Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada, the first 4 events this year, had a significant impact on the final outcome? The argument would be they're very unrepresentative of the United States as a whole, and they help to determine so much. So some people would argue go to regional primaries. It would be something similar to the primaries held April 26th when you had those primaries. What if you added New Jersey to that mix? What if you added Massachusetts to that mix? And what if you added New York to really have a true middle Atlantic? Question there is, when do you have a regional primary? Okay? And how does that regional primary relate to the others? So the third possibility is go to a series of national primaries. Perhaps have a primary there where you would have a national primary with all the candidates and then winnow down candidates. Problem with that is name recognition would be important, and the type of campaigning would be different. The fourth thing that many people talk about is we need to control the money. There's too much money in this process. Certainly Bernie Sanders talked about it. Trump has talked about it, as has Clinton and others. But the point is, how are you going to control that? Are you going to put a limit, and will the courts permit that limit? Can you have some sort of public funding that will be embraced by the candidates? I think every specific suggestion to try to change things comes back to one critical point. The political parties control this process, and it would be very difficult to get any significant change without having change in the thinking of the political parties. So for better or worse, I would argue that if I were a candidate thinking about running in 2016, I'd go back and study this campaign very carefully, 2012, 2008, probably back to 2000, study the last 5 campaigns very carefully, and then I would get prepared assuming that the same set of rules are going to be in place, or similar rules will be in place as we approach 2020. So with that as a conclusion, I'd like to thank you for being part of the massive open online MOOC course called Road to the White House. I've enjoyed putting these lectures together. Hopefully they've met your expectations also. And I look forward to seeing you in the fall when I do another MOOC on continuation of the Road to the White House. And I guarantee you that by the time that course is done, we'll have a president elected, unless it goes into the House of Representatives, and I don't think it will. So that being the case, thank you. Hope to see you this summer for the MOOC dealing with political conventions. Thank you.